the idea that Folio needs like more developers, like a reasonable assumption that people, yeah, is that like a thumbs up? So it looks like it's a maybe. Here, let me look. So it's not a definitive yes. Then that makes me think that some of the other questions might be relevant, which is, you know, if there are places where it feels like development isn't efficient, is the problem that it's not that there's not enough people, but that there's like process issues, or we were just some of us in a session about architecture and what it's like to try to get a module into Folio or understand the processes around that. So that might be something to consider, that it might not just be an add more people problem, but a use what we have better problem. So, and then the next question is this developer organizational diversity, a community health concern for Folio. So this I've definitely had come up in conversation, and this is about the like, are there enough developers from different places working on Folio? And if not, should we increase the number of places that developers are coming from through whatever way? And one thing I was thinking about with this, so as I said, I work at Cornell, so I'm in a really specific context, as are we all. And one place that there might be organizational diversity that not everybody sees is with international development. And so that's something to keep in mind. Although, again, that could lead us back to process problems, right? Like, so if there's international develop happening, how does that come back? What's our support for localization and that kind of thing? And then last, sort of, and I feel like the answer to this might be obvious, but what's the difference between recruiting for technical skills versus other positions in Folio? A lot of institutions might have a lot of SMEs participating, or maybe they have a PO or documentation, but not technical skills. And so when we're going to try to recruit for development, what is the difference there? I don't remember which screen I'm sharing. Okay. So right now, whoops, I need to do that. I thought it would be good to just kind of go over my assumptions about how developers end up in Folio. And it would be really great for anybody who knows one of my assumptions is wrong to say so, or if you have a different idea about it. So for the most part, it seems like we have developers that are employed by vendors, and they could be part of a standing team, or they could be sort of a new team that's formed around a new module. They might be hired by an institution, but the idea here is that they're sort of employed by a commercial entity that is like involved in Folio. We have some developers coming in because they are employed by an institution, non-commercial, academic. I put consortia in here, and they might come and join one of the vendor teams to help with development. Their institution might put together a team, or maybe multiple institutions are putting together a team. And then someone might also kind of just join by themselves and work on work that they find. And then as far as I know, we aren't getting a lot of like individual, somebody showing up and just kind of motivated by their own interest, but that does happen in open source. You could imagine it happening. The nature of Folio is that it's obviously of more interest to organizations than individual humans. So for developers coming in from a vendor, I think the main thing I wanted to get across here is that at least if it's one of the vendors that's been involved in FOLIO, they kind of have a lot of support, right? They're coming in the footsteps of people who have been there. They have structures in their home organization. They have structures within FOLIO. Like there's some things they can depend on. And they also are potentially working for someone that's really got deep ties to the community. And can give them a lot of good guidance. That said, there's going to be challenges for vendor developers too. Like just because you come in on an EBSCO team doesn't necessarily mean everything's going to be easy for you. And what goes on in the home organization isn't necessarily visible to those of us in FOLIO. And a lot of the decisions might be made by the home organization, but we still want FOLIO to be a place where a vendor would say, yeah, I feel safe having my employees work in this community, a place where they would be able to grow and feel satisfaction from their work. And again, as I was thinking about this, I was wondering whether, you know, the vendor relationships seem really ensconced in kind of the community council area. And I'm not sure whether we think of bringing in new vendors as a source of new developers, aside from, it does seem to me like that sort of continued internationalization is probably a place where there's opportunity for new vendors and developers, is one of my thoughts about that. Let's see if I can just check. It keeps showing the chat red, even though there's nothing new. Okay. So now we're going to talk about institutional developers, but we're going to have a short data interlude. So this, I did a presentation yesterday, so some folks have already seen some things. For the, someone online is saying for vendors, the pressure has to come from a client or a group of clients. Like there's like a commercial motivation. You're building something for someone and has to tie back to a contract. So for institutions, so the data that I'm going to show from this survey, 92 Lyrasis members, 50% US doctoral, only 9% of the respondents outside the US, just to get numbers. So, and I won't spend too long on this in case people have already looked at this survey. I thought it was really interesting. So they asked people, how much does their institution directly donate to open source? And this is what it looked like. So the amount that folks are directly giving to OSS is kind of probably on the lower side. And it's really, maybe not that encouraging if you're hoping to sponsor like lots and lots of direct development from institutional funding. Oops, oh, I just wanted to, I've got this covered up, but the largest, the other sort of concern here potentially. So the most of the respondents were from doctoral institutions, and the two tallest, well, the tallest blue here is doctoral. That just implies that funding is coming from a really specific set of institutions. And so you might wonder about equity concerns if only a certain kind of institution ever has money to directly contribute to open source. So this is, I was asking them how much staff time, and this goes back to one of those first questions of like the difference between recruiting technical contributors and non-technical. So you can see that 48% are not allocating any technical staff time. whereas for non-technical, it's only 37%. And the number of, so there's an other, and I'm not sure what that 11% is, but the number giving like a full FTE and up is 11%, it looks like. So it's small. People are obviously, it looks like, a lot more comfortable giving non-technical contributions. And then they ask them, like, when you decide to make those contributions, why? What's sort of like your decision making? And the largest bar here is that the folks who are able to give money want to make sure that the program is sustained. And I think it's interesting that, sometimes we talk about people wanting to do development sort of for their own features, and that's certainly on here, in-house control and customization, agility to address user needs, but sustainability is more important than either one of those. People, once they get into an open source program, want to make sure it's going to stick around. And then the last one, so this survey is 2 years old, so maybe this would look different now. But I thought this was really interesting because I kind of expected for the institutional mission to be like a big reason people wanted to use open source. And for 61% of them, it says the institutional mission doesn't affect their decision-making at all around open source. And I thought that was surprising. And 5% discourages it, which seems sort of not great. And then only a third-ish says their mission encourages it. I wonder a little bit about what this means. Whether there's different ways to think about the mission, or whether some people just really don't see it in the mission, or if there's a way projects, as we saw yesterday morning, to talk more about how open source connects to some of those open data, open science, open research questions. All right, so all of that to keep in mind, I guess, when we talk about trying to get institutional developers. So it seems like there's a couple points right now where it seems like we assume that folks might decide to give development resources. One is when they're going live and decide, oh no, this thing doesn't exist and we can't go live without it. And then, also after they've been around for a little while, they decide there's something that they for institutions, because they're the actual users of Folio, they have this other decision point about whether they're going to build something, whether they're going to build a barnacle, or whether they're going to build a something that's in local that connects via the API, or contribute something to Folio directly. And then there's this question of whether they have local developers they could give, or whether they want to sponsor development. And then just sort of questions here. So I don't know if anybody's been watching Slack this morning, but there was a bunch of people freaking out because Snapshot wasn't working, right? And so that always brings up these questions of like the boring parts. So when we're looking to get institutional involvement, will that always be feature seeking, or will it sometimes be? Then, so my assumption, and much of the rest of the presentation is about this, is developer experience more important in the recruitment of institutional developers? And I think the answer to this is yes. So sponsored developers are one thing, but if we really think institutions, local developers that they want to bring into the project, those developers are probably much loved by their institution. And if they join a FOLIO team and have a bad experience and say, I don't want to do this anymore, their institution is probably going to say, okay. So it's just something to think about. And I think there's also it would be nice for institutions if the folks they have in their departments were interested in FOLIO. If FOLIO was an interesting project, if FOLIO was something that someone might say, hey, if there's something I can do on that project, I want to. If that was something they were saying to their manager, that would be encouraging as well. So thinking about institutions, again, off that other chart, like some folks have zero access to IT resources, and some folks have a team of 6 that works on their discovery layer and sprints every other month, right? Like, so the community does provide a bit of a framework, sort of, for sponsored development. Now I say sort of because it's happened. It's happening, right? It happened with the single record import. We were talking about that yesterday. I believe it's happening with the serials claiming right now. It definitely happens with the German development, I think, really runs this way. But someone there can correct me if I'm wrong. But I'm wondering if there's too much mystery around it. There was questions yesterday, like, how do you make that happen? And for some of us who have been in the project for 3 years right now, you might go, oh, you just talked to community council. But like, that is that visible? Is that transparent enough? And if we've already had successful versions of this, like, where is that written down so someone can say, here's how we did this before? So that's a question. Like, when we bring someone on, what do we say to them about pathways to development? Work on existing modules for institutions that have developers, maybe don't want to build something new. Working on an existing module could be less long-term commitment, because if you do submit a module, you've got this like long-term maintenance situation, right? And so should we consider ways to identify things in existing modules that might be good first issue issues? So this is a common practice on GitHub, where you can tag things and say, like, this is a good first issue for someone to try. And I'm not sure that we have anything quite like that yet. Again, partnering with the vendors can bring in orientation. So your question about sponsored development goes right to your hosting company. They're probably going to be able to help you, which is good. Maybe it's good if there's more visibility into that too. So it's not just you trying to fund it all by yourself, but being able to find other people to help. And then this new developer advocate position is going to be another resource that we can offer institutions. Okay, so this is another interlude, I guess. So FOLIO is an open source project. And so when you come to an open source project, you might make some assumptions about the culture of that project. And these are some of them: that the things we make, we're going to share, that we're going to help each other, that there's a lot of expertise in the community, that there's a lot of cooperation in the community. And stuff like cooperation can be very tangible. And like, when I make a breaking change, I tell people, or I write really good tests, like that sort of actual development practice that leads to better cooperation. Reputation is really important in open source. And freedom is really important in open source. And somehow for a project like FOLIO, you have to balance. I think there can sometimes be this idea that sort of governance is in like opposition to freedom. But I think there's ways to make that work. And like, that's a place maybe that needs a lot of conversation. And then attribution sort of goes back to reputation, but like, one of the reasons people participate in open source is to further their career, right? So people want to be able to say, I worked on this project. It's a great project. Here's what I did. And it, making it transparent, who's doing what, especially in areas where like the compensation for doing the work might not be what the greatest or whatever. Attribution can go a long way. So one of the things that's changed in open source, like not just with Folio and not just yesterday, is that a lot of the discussion of open source is really around like kind of volunteer developers. And now, at least in Folio, almost all of our developers are employees, like they're being paid to work on the project. And so the developer kind of has their own ideas about open source. The organization they work for has ideas about open source. And those ideas may, but if the project has strong source values that are not so strong they cause burnout by like asking too much of people, then that can create like some good commitment between the developer and the project. And if the developer is really committed to their home organization, then that also can lead to greater commitment to the project. And a lot of this is about perception. And so I think one of the questions here is like, what is the perception of Folio's open source ideology? Because there's a lot of commercial involvement. Some people can feel like, oh, maybe it's not as open source as we want it to be, but it's not realistic to not have. And so ways in our processes that Folio can maintain the sort of freedom and attribution and cooperation, and kind of hang on to those open source values, even though there's commercial enterprises involved, can make a better experience for a developer who's invested in working on open source. So it's mostly just about kind of wanting developers that interact with Folio to have a good experience, sort of no matter where they're coming from. So one of the things that comes up in tech council sometimes is this language around developers, and the idea that like developers really are people. They're not resources. They're not like machines in some other room. They're people who need to like enjoy their jobs. The Folio environment needs to be good for them. The work needs to be satisfying. They need to feel like they're learning and getting things done. Especially if we're talking about institutional developers where this might not be the only part of their job. If you want them to stay engaged with Folio, then it needs to be a good experience. Burnout is obviously very real for developers too. And the answer to the question is, are some areas of development / maintenance more susceptible to causing burnout? The answer is yes. Like, I think, the whole DevOps situation and anything that's sort of like repetitive fire putting out, that's burnout. That's going to create burnout in people. And so how do we value the people doing that work, and make them want to stay Folio? And what about Folio could make a developer at an institution want to become a contributor, want to start coding for Folio? And then I guess a question that I had that we maybe talk about too is like the experience of Folio. So we sort of experienced the governance and community of Folio as like one or probably a couple of big things. But for the teams that are working on individual modules, are they really experiencing Folio as a whole, or are they just sort of getting to experience what's part of their team? And how does that vary? So if so someone was going to come from an institution, is their experience on one team going to be vastly different from an experience on another team? Okay. How can we make it easier for institutions to contribute developers? The sponsored funding, it seems like some of what we need there is just more conversation, documentation. We've got some potential places in the community to do this already. We've got the implementers group. I don't know how often discussion of shared development comes up in that group, but maybe it's something that gets put on the calendar. If an institution starts talking about development with their hosting company, is there a way to encourage them to bring that out into the community more? Library of Congress has been doing that a lot. Things that are in JIRA, obviously people are seeing. So it's not so much about the features, but more letting them know that they could ask other people, so that if the funding part is sort of a stumbling block, what are the ways that we can help them get over that? And then if they're going to actually like have an FTE spend, 20% or something on Folio, how do we make it clear that that participation is welcome? What kinds of participation are welcome? So if we create first issue issues in JIRA and someone wants to do drive-by contribution where you kind of contribute something and that's your thing. I saw someone the other day, there's a spelling error. Do a commit that just fixes a spelling error. Are teams going to welcome that work, or do they really need to join a team? How much autonomy does the developer and the institution have choosing work? Again, I think from the developer perspective, that whole freedom thing, when you're talking about open source, really matters. They want to work on something that's interesting. And then again, just are there places where we think it's maybe more open to institutional development? And of course, all of this is like telling the institutions. So the developer advocate position. So the developer advocate position definitely takes the opinion that Folio needs to develop more developers. But that institutions can't really have a discrete team. And so these are some different kinds of issues that those developers might be able to gather up and work on. And the developer advocate would support them in doing that. So CC approved sort of the initial proposal here. Folks are starting to work on fleshing it out. And so it makes sense, at least to me, that the step after that is like, who are the developers they're going to advocate for? And so kind of starting to think about who those people will be. Because, a lot of if someone's coming on to an established vendor team, they might not need this person. But someone who is coming in as completely new definitely would probably welcome the help. So I'm going to stop. Do you want to say anything else about the developer advocate?
It's up to you, your flow of presentation.
All right, I'm almost at the end, so I think I've got like one slide, and then we can discuss. I don't know how I'm doing. So this afternoon, there's going to be on surviving as an independent development team. And I think that will shed some light onto what it's like to come into the project. So previously, we were maintaining this page on the wiki, where this is how we were communicating that we wanted folks to offer help. It got out of date. It used to be linked from the front page of the wiki. I unlinked it when I started prepping for this presentation because it hadn't been updated in so long. the resources that we're looking for listed by technology, some of which are no longer correct. And then mixed in with this was the product owner, and I don't want to get into a debate over what's technical and what's not, but and then some more specific developer position, including some things that were focused on reporting. So we should start seeing if other people want to talk besides me. But I think my opinion is that this page is pretty lacking. Like, this is not, I don't think you look at this and go, wow, I want to be a Folio developer. And it would be nice if we could kind of figure out like how to get that, wow, I want to be a Folio developer, or wow, I really understand what I need to do to fund a team or build a coalition to fund a team. Okay, let's see. That might be, yes, and that is it. All right, so we have one mic that we have to pass around. Do you want to talk a little?
I'll say we're going to, sure.
So those of us, including Owen Stevens and Alexis Manheim and myself and others who contributed to that developer advocate position, definitely agree with that core premise, that we need more developers, and especially the focus of that was on the institutional organizational diversity of those developers, as being important to the health of the project long term, making it as much of a real open source project as we can make it. I have an Android phone here. I love Android. Android is a fake open source project because one institution, one organization controls, essentially 100% of the development. I think myself, and I know others have heard from both small community members on the Folio project, as well as the largest members of the Folio project, all agreeing it would be better if there were more organizations involved. And how do we get that? So the goal of the advocate position was to address some of those pain points in helping potentially interested developers to ramp up in various ways, both by improving some of the documentation, onboarding and otherwise, by being available to answer questions, by helping to identify some JIRAs that are good starting points, as entry points, and connecting with other people, and a number of other benefits. I love your focus in the presentation on the motivations, that organizations have and that developers have in doing this work. And I think that points to the balance as the community and community council in particular moves forward to trying to hire advocates and getting more developers, in understanding that it's a two-way street, that we can go to a certain level of detail in how strictly we define both what an advocate position is and what the individual developers are. But ultimately, we need to find those interested people in both being an advocate and being a developer, and the motivations will differ. And I think it will be a good experience for the community to talk more with potentially interested people at a higher level, with broader requirements before they're nailed down to real specifics, and hear from people on what they're interested in contributing, and then find those commonalities. I think it was Terrence talk the other day about being interested in some of the lower hanging fruit, like where can we contribute to existing modules and solve some pain points, right? Which is fantastic. I've heard sometimes organizations making the assumption that developers are just there to introduce new modules or introduce new functionality. Both of those are true. It depends on the individual motivations. Similarly, the implication sometimes that one development team owns a module is true in an ownership sense, but as Jen pointed out, there's still the contribution opportunity of other teams and other individual developers contributing, and how can we encourage that as well? So that's my jumble of thoughts, but I think this is very helpful in understanding some of those possibilities, and as a community, figuring out different ways to work towards all of them, and work towards how can we sponsor individual development, contribute individual development, not just as the more formal teams, structured, multiple FTEs of development time, et cetera, that has been the predominant, but not the only model.
So I'm going to make one quibble with what you said, which is just about open source. So Android is definitely open source. Open source is a licensing scheme, right? And so if you've got an open source license, you're open source, even if it's only one company contributing. We use an Apache license, which means people can put FOLIO into commercial products. And so that's obviously a decision. Other Viewfind does not use Apache. They use you cannot put Viewfind in commercial they have. So we're open. Yeah, we're using an open source license. We're open source. The development practices are separate from that, which I think the only reason it's good to it's good to keep in mind exactly what that definition of open source is. Anyway, yep.
I have a couple of questions, and I don't know who can answer it, but I guess first question is, looking at your three categories that you have on your slideshow of a vendor, institutional, and individual, how many devs in total does the project have? How many institutional teams are there? Like breakdown. And honestly, are there any individuals?
I don't think so.
Well, I don't think so either. But it's something, because I think the barrier to entry is too high. That's the primary, and partly because the product is super complicated. You can't just go join and look at a GitHub issue, check it out, and go, hey, I fixed the spelling mistake. It's way more complex than that. But I guess understanding the makeup of everything is sort of interesting. I'm involved in that other thing later, but us coming and wanting to join and contribute hasn't been straightforward. I thought it'd be way easier. It's actually been way more complicated. There's a lot of process involved, and I'm actually not opposed to the process and stuff like that, but actually most of it you don't even know it's there. And you don't know who to talk to, who the people who've been around for the last 7 years know who to talk to, but you don't know who to talk to. And I think so that your position, the developer advocate, whoever that is, or whatever that becomes, is very important. I think Lee, I don't know what his last name is, Lee, I think that dude, yeah. So he sort of helped us a bit, and we were floundering in an ocean of pain, right? We didn't know what was going on, who to talk to. It's not like the people are unhelpful, but you don't know who's, and different teams do different things in different ways. So I think it's kind of there's so many barriers. The other thing I've often thought is, in our institution, and most of the institutions are universities, right? Would that be right in FOLIO?
And then portion, I guess.
So let's just say university. A lot of the universities have comp sci students with zero experience doing nothing except university assignments. It'd be really cool if there could be a program of encouraging students to do some of the low-hanging fruit as part of almost like a job experience stream, managed then by a developer person overseeing it. Maybe you could harness more people, and then maybe some of them go on to become larger contributors. I mean, we've done that a few times at our institution, the local universities, and some of our best staff over the years started as second-year students, knocking a few the lowest hanging Jira defects off. Yeah. Yeah. So I think, I don't know, just if you're trying to find more people, rather than bringing in, a person 15 years experience and trying to grab the most experienced people. Anyway, I'm just rambling. Sorry.
Alexis was saying the University of Alabama actually super successful with that. So they did the upgrade with the calendar. And then I believe their student developer got hired by EBSCO. So yeah, exactly what you're talking about.
Thank you. Okay, here we go. So yeah, I love what you were suggesting just now, Terence. I actually I thought that it's kind of an opportunity, diversity and inclusion, looking at the workforce, kind of thinking, it can be sponsored by EBSCO, index data, knowledge integration, all of that stuff too, because that's kind of great to kind of, good positive direction to bring in new students, computer science people, to work on this. One thing that I kind of wonder generally is like the process. So I think Mike and I are committed to work on the PD or kind of with you, Alexis and Maccabee and Jen. But you know, like, so where are we going to post it? Like, do you have a? I guess that's kind of where I'm kind of getting a little stuck, and I think you know, like with Lehigh, you know, Maccabee is putting good energy into into this project because we believe in it. But honestly, you know, like kind of thinking, you know, Michelle, that was Maccabee's predecessor that moved to work in EBSCO. You know, like there is a question about sustainability on the organization level that needs to be also addressed, and that DNA of like, you know, keep on hiring, keep on, you know, onboarding, keep on, you know, with the project is something I'm thinking of as we're going about it. So like it will be great to get some insight. I noticed that there is no innovation mentioned in the values, you know, and that's interesting. Like I joined this project because I was very keen on new ideas to kind of, you know, like make them practical, to kind of, you know, like was a talk about the marketplace, or like, you know, kind of we're going to develop our own apps in the institutions. We're going to put them somewhere. So that means reputation. That means, you know, kind of energy investment in, you know, like making sure that what we need actually happens. So there is that gap that I would love to somehow resolve. Otherwise, this position sounds really excellent to me, like having, you know, like an advocate that talks, that bridge to developers as they come in. So how long has it been now, Maccabee? 2 years that you're, year and a half. So a year and a half later, you know, Maccabee is doing so many things. And I think that, you know, like we want to kind of make sure that some of those lessons are learned and all of that. But that's working on what you were suggesting now, Terence, to kind of, you know, look at the students as they come to the projects. Golden, I'd love to do that. Thanks.
I pardon me. I am a developer, and I actually did spend some time working on the Folio project. I have a lot to say about that experience. I'll boil it down to just 3 things that I think are really, really important. The first is, I think if you want institutional programmers, you need a much more robust onboarding process. Folio is a very large, complicated project with lots of moving pieces, very complicated procedures, extremely specialized forms of programming, custom-built tooling. And my experience in learning all of that was basically get assigned to a team, figure it out yourself. That's not sustainable. The other thing that I think you're going to have to struggle with is when you're talking about institutional developers, those people were not necessarily recruited with the skill set to work on Folio. That was also my experience. I really struggled with the kind of programming that we were doing. So how do you steer programmers towards work that's appropriate to their level of skill and experience? And the third thing is my institution was really not happy with how my time was valued as a developer. And that made it really easy for me to ask the institution to be taken off the project because they weren't really invested in keeping me on it. So, yeah.
Developers in my institution that asked to get taken off.
I think the hope is that with the developer advocate position, that folks who don't have the experience will gain experience with the developer advocate as their guide. And then eventually they could maybe, if they want to, if their institution will let them, do more, join a team, etc. Otherwise, yeah, it just seems like folks are just being thrown into the pool, which is not fair. And then no one's going to want to join or stick around. So we don't know. This is an experiment. We don't know what this is going to be. Maybe it'll morph into something else. But it seemed like a good place to start to get folks involved. When yes, there are a lot of barriers at this point. So.
halfway check. I'm really interested in the comment you made about your institution not valuing your time spent. Could you talk more about that?
Okay, so my understanding of this may be a bit flawed because this happened a bit above my head, but my understanding is that when you donate development time, you get a certain amount of credit towards membership fees. They were not happy with the amount. They felt that that was not, I mean, they looked at my salary and there was like, this is not even like a third or a quarter of your salary, the salary that we're paying you. So that is not, it was a big sticking point for them. I actually had to argue pretty hard to get put on the project at all, because I wanted to be part of it. And again, it made it really easy for me to say, I don't want to be on the project anymore. They're like, cool. We don't really like how they're valuing your time anyway.
Yeah, when you said the thing about valuing your time, I was wondering if it was related to, but it sounds like it's about value.
So I really like this presentation, especially the framing around developer experience, which we're talking about, but also the structure. I think the current structure of Folio is leading to Terrence's how many individual developers are there? Probably zero. How many institutional developers are there? Actually, probably not that many. We've constructed something where you have to buy in, you have to be pretty large, pretty well organized, and really be part of the structure. So, and if you have an institutional team that wants to do something, are they going to trip through another team's code? That's going to make both teams somewhat uncomfortable. Is there a way or a strategy where we could experiment with a lighter weight structure? I like the idea of picking out some bugs, but is there something above that where we could experiment without, you don't need to form an 8-person team with QA and all the existing infrastructure? How can we make it easier to contribute at smaller levels?
Yeah, and I think that goes back to the innovation comment. I think in the list that I showed was tied towards freedom, and that if people have some choice in what they're doing and the cost of doing it isn't too high, they'll.
Agree with what Tom just said. There are different development models that we can encourage, and even before we encourage them, we can acknowledge their possibility. There are some assumptions built in to the way that development teams are described in some of our materials on the wiki that assume certain infrastructure, that assume everyone who's developing is part of a team. They have a PO, they have a dev lead, they have a Scratch environment to do their work, and all those things are common. None of those things are necessary in a broader definition of what a dev team can do and how a dev team can operate. There are assumptions about sprints, and people being, some multiple of one, some integral multiple of one FTE assigned, which is also not actually necessary. Work that I've done, that others I know have done, has been more, okay, before this flower release is done, I'm going to have a few days to contribute a few bug fixes or a few new features or whatever. And making those models more visible and more documented is important. And I agree. I'm sorry, I didn't know your name. Kyle, thank you. Yeah, just talking about that experience and some of the roadblocks to new development. Definitely, as Jen said, those are exactly, and Alexa said, those are exactly some of the things that we want to address with the advocate position in terms of that onboarding process, that new developer documentation. Setting up the environment is near impossible. Getting questions answered is extremely difficult. It's good to have more commonality on these challenges. Sometimes I think there's consensus from many of the folks in the room on some of these things, but not necessarily everybody in the community. And it's good to have these concerns raised. And hopefully in the session this afternoon, we'll hear whether it's the same perspective or a different perspective on some of these challenges, what a development team means in other contexts. And to define these things more broadly, what developers can be, as Jen outlined.
think it's quite different depending what part of the world you come from, depending on how you fund a role and what it means for your institution. But I do think ultimately the value to an organization often is, can they see it? And so I don't mean just bug fixing, but like the smaller features that are a step above a bug, but they actually are contributed that. And if you have an institution running Folio and then you've got one developer who's been contributing and then they added a new, I don't know, the ability to sort on some list or something, and they know that person added that adds a bit of value, not only value to the developer, but to the actual organization as well. They can actually see it rather than saying, I fixed a performance issue that's opaque, that you can't really articulate. And I think that's potential value that I think, and I do think the classification of things of that. I think the other thing as well is that if you're standing up like a random dude, right? So like you've got an institution, you want one guy and he joins or she joins. It is such a large hurdle to overcome. So like when I've run dev teams at home and we're running a product that we've already had, because Folio is now a developed product. It's mature, that the code base is large, there's a lot of going on. You normally have a wingman. And you go sit next to the person, and Sally is the person who's experienced. John is the new person who's joined, and John sits there, and every 5 minutes he's saying, "Hey, Sally, look, I can't seem to like debug this thing, and how does this thing connect?" And then that person goes from zero productivity to some kind of productivity within weeks, right? I think we've got a huge hurdle to overcome. It's not just the documentation about bringing people to be productive. The guy I brought on, which is a very experienced developer, is very small in our objectives, which I'll talk about this afternoon. He took I think 2 months before he cut a single line of code to actually do anything meaningful. If I told my people running, hopefully this is not recorded, maybe I should stop recording. But because he's a per hour contractor that joined my project. If I told my people that my project board, hey, I've got this guy, and after 3 months, he's dropped 1 line of code or 3 lines of code into the code base. He finally got it approved at $150 an hour at 40 hours a week. That is pretty not really value for money in essence. So I think that's sort of the challenge that you've got to get from zero. And when we've had other projects that I've run with, different teams, I can get people productive within 2 weeks, at least a certain measure. And I don't think that's possible in the current context, I think.
Is it like we're not looking for the right skills when we're like, somebody said that, I forgot who it was. I'm sorry who it was. That, like whoever is doing development doesn't have the right skills or experience in doing the work. Is that connected? I know there is an onboarding issue. I'm just curious.
That list was in part just trying to find it, but I also think there's a question here, right? So when you're hiring people, you can have a small door and everybody has to fit through that tiny door, or you can have a big door because you're willing to invest in them and get them where you want them. The value, like, I understand what you're saying, right? So if it takes 2 months till they're doing something that seems valuable, that can maybe make you want to lean towards a small door. But obviously there's also pluses to a bigger door, but then there has to be the onboarding when they get there, right?
So in my example, this person was super experienced that had almost every skill.
So it's because of the project. It's what Martin's saying about
you had all the skill listed on your skill set. So it wasn't like I was hiring, it's done Python or something, and now it's hardcore Java with Kafka running, build systems, etc. I'm hiring pretty much people because I've got a project outcome I'm trying to achieve. So I'm trying to find super experienced people. And if they're struggling to get up to speed, then the barrier to entry is pretty high. That's the cost to play is very, very high. And I think that's sort of I don't know how to overcome the challenge. I don't have a solution. I need to think about it a bit more, but that's challenging.
I think others.
Yeah.
Presentation this morning. And I think when we're talking about these architecture questions, one of the questions should be, make it easier or harder.
Yep.
I couldn't tell you, but you think it should be easier. Okay, I think we are hitting up against time. So the developer advocate folks are obviously going to keep working. I think TC and some other combination of people will maybe work on that not required skills, but skills we're looking for page. Maybe I'll put something somewhere on Slack to ask for people that are interested in looking at that communication. And then it sounds like CC will keep working on helping institutions give.
It's going to be good to know from your end how to attract people.
Yeah, I think we should talk about that. Yes. All right. Thank you. Thanks, folks online too.